In the glittering world of international high society where million-dollar charity galas and royal connections determine your worth, one woman thought her famous marriage would open every door in the Middle East. She was wrong. When the most prestigious emirate in the world slammed its golden gate shut on former Hollywood actress turned Duchess Isabella Montgomery, the rejection sent shockwaves through social media and sparked a war of words that would captivate millions. This is the story of pride, power, and the dangerous game of celebrity diplomacy gone wrong. A tale where East meets West, tradition clashes with modernity, and one woman's fury threatens to burn bridges worth billions. What happens when someone accustomed to red carpets and royal treatment discovers that not every kingdom bows to fame? The answer would shake two continents and reveal the hidden world where money, influence, and reputation collide in the most spectacular way possible. Isabella Montgomery stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Montecito mansion, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The morning California sun painted everything in gold, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold frustration building in her chest. In her perfectly manicured hand, she held her phone, displaying an email that had arrived just 20 minutes ago. An email that would change everything. The message was from her publicist, Sarah Chen, and it contained news that Isabella had been dreading for weeks. The Dubai International Humanitarian Summit, the most prestigious charity event in the Middle East, had officially announced its guest list for the upcoming gala. Every major celebrity, royal family member, and philanthropist who mattered would be there. Every major name except one. Isabella Montgomery, Duchess of Wessingham, former Hollywood A-lister, and wife to Prince Alexander, had been deliberately excluded. The rejection stung deeper than any bad movie review or tabloid scandal she had endured during her acting career. This wasn't just about missing a party. This was about respect, recognition, and her carefully constructed image as a global humanitarian. For months, her team had been reaching out to the Dubai Cultural Foundation, dropping hints about her availability, her charitable work, and her royal connections. They had even suggested she could deliver the keynote speech about women's empowerment in developing nations. The response had been polite but firm. No invitation would be forthcoming. Isabella moved away from the window and sank into her white leather chair, the same one where she had given that famous interview about leaving Hollywood for love. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had traded red carpets for royal duties, believing it would elevate her status on the world stage. Instead, she found herself facing closed doors in places where she expected to be welcomed with open arms. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant, Marcus. The Times wants a statement about the Dubai situation. How should I respond? Isabella's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to craft something diplomatic, perhaps expressing disappointment, while maintaining dignity. But another part, the part that had fought tooth and nail to make it in Hollywood, wanted to fight back. She had spent years perfecting her public image as a compassionate global citizen, and now some committee of strangers was treating her like she didn't matter. The truth was more complex than the media would ever understand. Isabella's exclusion from the Dubai summit wasn't random or personal in the traditional sense. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign by several influential figures who saw her as representing everything wrong with celebrity activism. 3 months earlier, Isabella had made what she thought was a harmless comment during a podcast interview. She had criticized certain Middle Eastern countries for their treatment of women, specifically mentioning the need for more female representation in government positions. The comment had been thoughtful and well-researched, backed by statistics and delivered with her signature eloquence. But in the interconnected world of international diplomacy, even well-intentioned words could have unintended consequences. Isabella's comments had been interpreted by some as presumptuous, particularly coming from someone who had recently entered the world of royal duty. The sentiment among certain circles was that she needed to understand her place before lecturing others about theirs. Dr. Amara al-Rashid, a prominent Emirati businesswoman and member of the Dubai Cultural Foundation's board, had been particularly vocal in private circles about Isabella's comments. She speaks as if she understands our culture after reading a few reports, Dr. al-Rashid had reportedly said during a board meeting. Real change comes from within, not from celebrity pronouncements made from mansions in California. These private criticisms had eventually reached the ears of Isabella's contacts in the region. Her friend, socialite Priya Sharma, who had connections throughout the Gulf states, had warned her weeks ago that there was resistance to her involvement in regional events. They see you as trying to be the white savior, Priya had explained during a lunch at the Beverly Hills Hotel. It doesn't matter that you're married to royalty or that you've done genuine charity work. Some people think you're using their struggles as a platform for your own relevance. Isabella had dismissed the warning at the time, confident that her intentions were pure and her platform was powerful enough to overcome any resistance. She believed that her fame and royal connections would eventually win over any skeptics. She was learning that she had been wrong. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Prince Alexander, calling from London, where he was attending a series of ceremonial duties. "Darling, I heard about Dubai." His cultured British accent carried concern across the ocean. "I'm sorry this has happened." Isabella appreciated his support, but she could hear something else in his voice, relief perhaps. Alexander had never been entirely comfortable with Isabella's high-profile approach to their royal duties. He preferred the traditional model of quiet service and behind-the-scenes influence. Isabella's media-savvy style, while effective in many ways, sometimes created complications he would rather avoid. "What do you think I should do?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew his answer. "Perhaps it's best to let this pass quietly," Alexander suggested. "There will be other opportunities. The important thing is the work itself, not the recognition." It was exactly what she had expected him to say, and exactly what she didn't want to hear. Alexander came from a world where snubs were absorbed with dignity, where public feuds were considered undignified, and where patience was valued above immediate satisfaction. Isabella understood the wisdom in this approach, but it went against every instinct that had made her successful. After ending the call, Isabella walked to her home office, a room lined with awards from her acting career and photographs from her humanitarian trips. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal where she had been writing her memoirs, tentatively titled "From Hollywood to Palace, A Journey of Purpose." She opened the journal and began writing, her thoughts flowing faster than her pen could capture them. She wrote about the frustration of being judged before being heard, about the complexity of trying to do good in a world where every word was scrutinized, and about the challenge of balancing authenticity with diplomacy. As she wrote, Isabella began to see the Dubai rejection not as an ending, but as a beginning. If traditional channels were closed to her, she would create her own. If established institutions wouldn't recognize her contributions, she would build platforms that would be impossible to ignore. The idea that began forming in her mind was ambitious and risky. Instead of quietly accepting the snub, Isabella would launch her own international humanitarian initiative. She would create a summit that would rival Dubai's event, bringing together progressive voices from around the world to discuss real solutions to global challenges. She would show everyone, especially those who had dismissed her, that exclusion could be transformed into innovation. Isabella reached for her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. She had relationships with tech billionaires in Silicon Valley, entertainment moguls in Los Angeles, and progressive politicians around the world. If she could bring them together with genuine activists and changemakers, she could create something more impactful than any traditional charitable gala. Her fingers moved quickly as she began drafting messages to potential collaborators. To tech entrepreneur David Chen, "I have an idea that could change how we approach global philanthropy. Are you free for lunch this week?" To media mogul Patricia Williams,
"What if we could create the most influential humanitarian event of the decade?"
"I need your expertise." With each message sent, Isabella felt her energy returning. The sting of rejection was transforming into the fuel of determination. She had always been at her best when fighting against the odds, and this felt like the biggest fight of her post-Hollywood career. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Pacific, Isabella Montgomery was no longer the disappointed duchess who had started the day reading about her exclusion. She was becoming something more dangerous to those who had underestimated her, a woman with unlimited resources, influential connections, and a burning desire to prove herself on her own terms. The phone buzzed with responses to her messages. David Chen was intrigued and wanted to meet immediately. Patricia Williams was already brainstorming media partnerships. Other contacts were expressing interest and offering resources. Isabella smiled for the first time that day. Dubai might have turned its back on her, but she was about to turn towards something bigger. The rejection that was meant to diminish her influence was about to become the catalyst for expanding it beyond anything those who had dismissed her could have imagined. The war was just beginning, and Isabella Montgomery had no intention of surrendering. 3 weeks after the Dubai snub, Isabella Montgomery's Montecito estate had been transformed into a war room. The elegant living spaces now buzzed with the energy of a tech startup crossed with a political campaign headquarters. Laptops, charts, and planning documents covered every surface, while a steady stream of advisors, publicists, and potential partners flowed through the doors. Isabella stood at the head of her dining table, which had been converted into a command center, addressing a room full of some of the most influential people in media, technology, and entertainment. The gathering looked like a scene from a high-stakes thriller. Billionaire tech mogul David Chen sat next to Academy Award-winning producer Patricia Williams, while social media influencer and activist Maya Patel discussed strategy with former UN diplomat Robert Sterling. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isabella began, her voice carrying the confidence that had once commanded Hollywood sets and royal audiences alike, "we're not just planning an event, we're creating a movement." The project had a name now, the Global Impact Alliance Summit. What had started as Isabella's response to personal rejection had evolved into something much larger and more ambitious. The summit would be a 3-day event featuring panels, workshops, and networking sessions focused on actionable solutions to global challenges. Unlike traditional charity galas that focused on fundraising, this event would emphasize implementation and measurable results. David Chen leaned forward, his eyes bright with entrepreneurial excitement. "The technology platform alone will be revolutionary. We're talking about real-time impact tracking, blockchain-verified donations, and AI-powered matching between donors and projects. This isn't just a summit, it's a complete ecosystem for global change." Isabella nodded, feeling the familiar thrill of a project gaining momentum. But beneath the excitement, she was keenly aware of the growing resistance to her plans. Word of the Global Impact Alliance had spread quickly through diplomatic and charitable circles, and not everyone was pleased with her initiative. The criticism had started subtly, with unnamed sources quoted in industry publications questioning whether the world needed another celebrity-driven charitable platform. Then came the more direct attacks. Dr. Amara al-Rashid, the same Emirati businesswoman who had opposed Isabella's inclusion in the Dubai summit, had given an interview to the Financial Times that was clearly aimed at undermining Isabella's credibility.
"We see this pattern repeatedly," Dr.
al-Rashid had said. "Western celebrities, often with good intentions, create parallel systems that ultimately divert attention and resources from established, effective organizations that have been doing this work for decades. It's a form of charitable colonialism disguised as innovation." The quote had stung, partly because Isabella recognized there might be some truth in it. She had spent sleepless nights questioning her motivations, wondering if her desire to prove herself was overshadowing her genuine commitment to helping others. But each morning she returned to the same conclusion. If existing systems were so effective, why did global problems persist? Perhaps disruption was exactly what was needed. The media attention had intensified as more details about the Global Impact Alliance emerged. Isabella's team had strategically leaked information about the high-profile attendees who had committed to participating. Tech titans, progressive politicians, entertainment industry leaders, and genuine grassroots activists were all confirmed speakers. The guest list read like a who's who of global influence, and traditional charitable organizations were taking notice. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from her publicist Sarah Chen. "CNN wants an exclusive interview about the summit. They're particularly interested in your response to the Dubai situation and the criticism from established NGOs." This was the opportunity Isabella had been waiting for. She had been careful not to publicly address the Dubai snub directly, following Alexander's advice to maintain dignity. But now, with her own platform gaining international attention, she could tell her side of the story without appearing reactive or petty.
"Schedule it," she texted back.
"I'm ready." That evening, Isabella sat in her home office reviewing talking points for the CNN interview when Alexander called from London. Their conversations had become more tense lately as the media coverage of Isabella's summit intensified. "Darling, I've been hearing things," Alexander said, his voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there months earlier. "The palace is receiving inquiries about your summit. Some are asking whether this represents an official royal position on international charitable work." Isabella felt her jaw tighten. "And what are you telling them?" "That this is your personal initiative, of course. But you have to understand the position this puts us in. The royal family maintains relationships with many of the organizations and governments that your critics represent." "So you want me to scale back?" Isabella's voice had an edge she didn't try to hide. "I want you to consider the broader implications. Your success is important to me. But so is maintaining the diplomatic relationships that allow us to do our work effectively." The conversation ended with both of them frustrated and neither feeling heard. Isabella understood Alexander's position, but she also felt that his concern for diplomatic niceties was exactly the kind of thinking that kept real change from happening. Sometimes, she thought, relationships needed to be disrupted if progress was going to occur. 2 days later, Isabella sat across from CNN's Anderson Cooper in her perfectly arranged living room. The interview was being broadcast live, and Isabella knew that millions of people around the world were watching. This was her chance to frame the narrative on her own terms. Duchess Montgomery, Cooper began, "Your Global Impact Alliance Summit has generated significant buzz, but also considerable controversy. How do you respond to critics who say this is simply a reaction to being excluded from the Dubai summit?" Isabella had prepared for this question, but hearing it asked so directly still sent a spike of adrenaline through her system. She leaned forward slightly, her media training kicking in as she made direct eye contact with the camera. "Anderson, I think that framing reveals exactly the problem we're trying to solve," she said, her voice steady and confident. "The assumption that innovation in charitable work must be motivated by personal grievance rather than genuine desire for progress. Yes, I was disappointed not to be included in Dubai's summit. But that disappointment opened my eyes to a larger issue, the gatekeeping that prevents new voices and new approaches from contributing to solving global problems." Cooper pressed further. "Dr. Amar al-Rashid has characterized your summit as charitable colonialism. How do you respond to that?" Isabella had known this question was coming, and she had decided to address it head-on rather than deflect.
Dr. P.
Al-Rashid raises an important concern that anyone doing international work should take seriously. "The last thing I want is to impose solutions from the outside. That's why our summit features voices from every region of the world, with local activists and changemakers taking leadership roles in defining problems and solutions. We're not trying to save anyone. We're trying to create a platform where people can save themselves, with support and resources from those who want to help." The interview continued for 20 minutes, with Isabella addressing questions about her motivations, her methods, and her goals. She spoke passionately about the need for measurable impact, innovative funding models, and inclusive decision-making. By the end, even Cooper seemed impressed by her preparation and sincerity. But Isabella knew the real test would come in the response to the interview. Within hours, social media was buzzing with clips and reactions. Supporters praised her eloquence and vision, while critics dismissed her as an out-of-touch celebrity playing with real people's lives. The polarization was exactly what she had expected, and in some ways what she had hoped for. Controversy meant attention, and attention meant opportunity. The most significant response came not from social media, but from a private message Isabella received that evening. It was from Fatima Al-Zahra, a young Emirati entrepreneur who had been following the summit coverage. The message was brief but powerful. "Duchess Montgomery, I watched your interview tonight. I disagree with Dr. al-Rashid's characterization of your work. As a young woman trying to create change in the region, I know how difficult it can be when established voices speak for all of us. I would be honored to participate in your summit and represent a different perspective from the UAE." Isabella stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something shift in her understanding of the situation. She had been thinking about the conflict in terms of East versus West, tradition versus innovation, establishment versus disruption. But Fatima's message reminded her that within every community, there were multiple voices and perspectives. Her job wasn't to speak for anyone, but to create space for voices that might not otherwise be heard. She immediately responded to Fatima, inviting her not just to participate, but to help shape the summit's programming. This was followed by similar outreach to other young leaders who had been engaging with the summit coverage online. Isabella began to see a different path forward, one that didn't require her to be the face of the movement, but rather its facilitator. Over the following days, the summit's social media presence exploded as young activists from around the world began sharing their own stories and ideas. The hashtag #GlobalImpactAlliance trended in multiple countries, with posts in dozens of languages. What had started as Isabella's response to personal rejection was becoming a genuine grassroots movement. But success also brought new challenges. The traditional charitable organizations that had initially dismissed Isabella's efforts were now taking them seriously enough to actively oppose them. A coalition of established NGOs issued a joint statement expressing concern about the proliferation of unproven charitable platforms and calling for donors to focus on organizations with proven track records. More troubling for Isabella personally was the strain the summit was placing on her marriage. Alexander had become increasingly distant as media coverage intensified. Their phone calls were shorter and less frequent, and when he did visit California, he seemed uncomfortable with the constant activity and attention surrounding the summit. The breaking point came during a particularly heated discussion about security arrangements for the summit. Alexander's protection officers had expressed concerns about the number of unknown participants and the potentially controversial nature of some discussions. Maybe we should consider postponing, Alexander suggested during a video call, at least until we can better assess the risks and ensure proper vetting of all participants. Isabella felt something snap inside her. Postponing? Alexander, we are 3 weeks away from an event that has the potential to change how the world approaches charitable work. And you want to postpone because some security officers are worried about managing a crowd? I'm worried about your safety, Isabella. And frankly, I'm worried about our reputation. This has grown beyond anything we originally discussed. Our reputation? Isabella's voice rose. Or your reputation. Because it seems like every time this summit gets more successful, you become more concerned about what people will think. The conversation ended with both of them angry, and Isabella more determined than ever to prove that her vision could succeed. She had come too far and invested too much to let fear or criticism derail her efforts now. As she hung up the phone, Isabella looked out at the Pacific Ocean, which had become her constant companion during this journey. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. In 3 weeks, representatives from 6 continents would gather to discuss real solutions to global problems. The summit that had started as her response to rejection was about to become the defining moment of her post-Hollywood career. The war that had begun with Dubai's snub was entering its final phase, and Isabella Montgomery had no intention of backing down now. The Santa Barbara Convention Center had been transformed into something that looked more like a UN assembly than a typical charity event. Delegates from 127 countries filled the main auditorium, their conversations creating a symphony of languages that reflected the truly global nature of Isabella Montgomery's vision. 3 massive screens displayed real-time data about projects being discussed, funding being committed, and partnerships being formed. Isabella stood backstage, watching the feeds from multiple cameras positioned throughout the venue. After months of planning, criticism, and doubt, the Global Impact Alliance Summit was finally happening, and it was exceeding even her most optimistic expectations. The attendance had grown beyond the original projections, with last-minute registrations coming from activists, entrepreneurs, and changemakers who had heard about the summit through social media and wanted to be part of something unprecedented. 5 minutes to your opening remarks, her assistant Marcus announced, his voice carrying the controlled excitement that had characterized the entire team over the past week. Isabella nodded, taking a deep breath and mentally reviewing the speech she had rewritten dozens of times. She had decided to open not with her own story, but with the stories of the young leaders who had reached out to her after the CNN interview. Fatima Al-Zahra from the UAE would introduce the first panel, while activists from Nigeria, Brazil, and Indonesia would lead discussions throughout the day. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that her response to being excluded had created the most inclusive charitable event of the year. Her phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. Watching the live stream from London, "You've created something remarkable. I'm proud of you." The message meant more to Isabella than she had expected. Their relationship had been strained throughout the summit planning, with Alexander's concerns about diplomatic implications clashing with Isabella's determination to push boundaries. But seeing her success, he seemed to understand what she had been trying to achieve all along. "This is it," Isabella whispered to herself as she walked toward the stage entrance. The past months flashed through her mind. The initial rejection from Dubai, the late-night planning sessions, the media criticism, the growing support from unexpected allies. Everything had led to this moment. As she walked onto the stage, the audience rose in sustained applause. Isabella could see faces from every continent, representing every age and background imaginable. In the front rows, she spotted the tech entrepreneurs who had helped design the summit's innovative platform. Behind them sat the traditional activists who had initially been skeptical, but had eventually embraced the summit's collaborative approach. Most meaningfully, Isabella could see the young leaders who had become the summit's true stars. Fatima Al-Zahra sat with other emerging voices from the Middle East. Maya Patel, the social media activist who had helped amplify the summit's message, was next to environmental campaigners from the Pacific Islands. These were the people who would ultimately determine whether the summit succeeded in creating lasting change. Friends, colleagues, and fellow changemakers, Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. 6 months ago, I experienced something that happens to many of us who want to make a difference in the world. I was told no. I was told that my voice wasn't needed, that established systems were sufficient, and that innovation might do more harm than good. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Today, I want to share what I learned from that rejection. I learned that being told no doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it means you're asking the right questions in the wrong places. Sometimes it means you need to create new places where those questions can be asked and answered. Isabella gestured towards the screens displaying real-time summit data. In the next 3 days, we will announce funding commitments totaling over $2 billion. More importantly, we will announce partnerships that connect local solutions with global resources in ways that have never been attempted before. But the real measure of our success won't be the money we raise or the attention we generate. It'll be the changes we create in communities around the world. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, but Isabella wasn't finished. I want to acknowledge the criticism this summit has received. Some have called it unnecessary, even harmful. I want those critics to know that their concerns were heard and took them seriously. That's why you'll notice that today's speakers are not celebrities or politicians making speeches about problems they've read about. Today's speakers are the people living those problems and creating solutions every day. As Isabella continued her opening remarks, she could see the impact of her words on the audience. But more importantly, she could feel the shift in her own understanding of what she had created. The summit had started as her response to personal rejection, but it had evolved into something much larger. She had become a facilitator of other people's voices, rather than amplifying her own. The first panel, moderated by Fatima Al-Zahra, focused on youth entrepreneurship in emerging economies. As Isabella listened from the wings, she was struck by the sophistication and passion of the discussion. These young leaders weren't talking about charity or aid. They were talking about business models, scalable solutions, and systemic change. During the lunch break, Isabella was approached by Dr. Amara Al-Rashid, whose criticism had been one of the most vocal throughout the summit planning process. Isabella tensed, expecting another confrontation. Duchess Montgomery, Dr. Al-Rashid said, extending her hand. I owe you an apology. Isabella was speechless for a moment. Dr. Al-Rashid, I didn't expect to see you here. I came because I wanted to understand what you were really trying to accomplish. I'll admit I was skeptical. But watching Fatima and the other young leaders today, I realize I made assumptions about your motivations that were unfair. The conversation that followed was one of the most meaningful of Isabella's entire summit experience. Dr. Al-Rashid explained that her initial opposition had been based on previous experiences with celebrity-driven charitable initiatives that had promised much but delivered little lasting change. But she acknowledged that Isabella's approach was fundamentally different. You stepped back and let others lead, Dr. Al-Rashid observed. That's not what I expected from someone with your platform and personality. Isabella smiled. I learned something important during this process. The most powerful thing I can do with my privilege isn't to speak louder, but to make sure other voices can be heard. By the second day of the summit, it was clear that something unprecedented was happening. The traditional model of charitable events typically involved presentations about problems followed by requests for donations. The Global Impact Alliance Summit had diverted this model, focusing on solutions and connecting people who could implement them with people who could support them. The technology platform that David Chen had developed was processing partnership requests in real time. Investors were connecting directly with social entrepreneurs. Established NGOs were finding new collaborators in unexpected places. Most importantly, young leaders from developing countries were forming networks that transcended traditional geographical and institutional boundaries. The media coverage reflected the summit's unique approach. Instead of focusing on celebrity appearances or fundraising totals, journalists were reporting on actual project launches and partnership announcements. CNN ran a feature about a collaboration between Silicon Valley technologists and Nigerian renewable energy startups that had been formed during a summit workshop. The BBC covered a new model for educational technology that emerged from discussions between Indian activists and Scandinavian educators. On the final day, Isabella stood once again before the full assembly, but this time she wasn't alone on stage. Fatima Al-Zahra stood beside her, along with representatives from each continent who had been selected by their peers to present the summit's outcomes. 3 days ago, we came together as strangers united by a common desire to create positive change, Isabella began. We leave as partners, collaborators, and friends. But more importantly, we leave with commitments that extend far beyond this room. Fatima stepped forward to announce the formation of the Global Youth Leaders Network, a permanent platform that would continue the work started at the summit. Other speakers announced similar ongoing initiatives: a technology sharing platform, a funding collaborative focused on women-led enterprises, and a series of regional summits that would take the alliance's model to other parts of the world. As the final presentations concluded, Isabella felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that she hadn't experienced since her most successful film premieres. But this was different. Those premieres had been about her achievements, her performance, her success. This summit was about what could be achieved when individual success was channeled into collective action. The standing ovation seemed to last forever, but Isabella knew it wasn't really for her. It was for the possibility that had been created in this room, the connections that had been formed, and the work that would continue long after everyone went home. Later that evening, as the convention center emptied and the equipment was being dismantled, Isabella walked alone through the space where so much energy and hope had been concentrated over the past 3 days. Her phone was buzzing constantly with messages from participants, media requests, and invitations to speak at other events around the world. But the message that mattered most had come earlier that afternoon from an unexpected source. It was from the organizing committee of the Dubai International Humanitarian Summit, expressing interest in collaborating on future initiatives and inviting Isabella to participate in next year's event. Isabella smiled as she read the message. 6 months ago, that invitation would have felt like vindication, proof that she had finally been accepted by the establishment she had been trying to join. Now, it felt like something different, an opportunity to bring the collaborative model she had developed to an even broader audience. She typed her response carefully. Thank you for the invitation. I would be honored to participate, and I'd like to discuss how we might incorporate some of the innovative approaches we've developed here. I believe our two events could complement each other beautifully. As Isabella walked to her car, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection that had seemed so devastating 6 months ago had led to the most fulfilling work of her life. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to being excluded isn't trying to break down doors, but building new spaces where everyone is welcomed. Her phone rang as she reached her car. It was Alexander, calling from London where he had been following the summit coverage. Darling, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I've been watching the news coverage all day. What you've accomplished is extraordinary. We accomplished, Isabella corrected. This was never just about me. I know that now. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were building. As Isabella drove home through the California hills, she thought about what came next. The summit was over, but the Global Impact Alliance was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, criticism to address, and skeptics to win over. But she also knew that she had created something that could outlast any individual controversy or personality. The woman who had started this journey seeking acceptance and recognition had discovered something more valuable: the ability to create spaces where others could find their own voices and build their own platforms for change. The rejection that had seemed like an ending had become the beginning of something much more significant than anything she could have imagined. Isabella Montgomery had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to being turned away isn't forcing your way in, but building something so compelling that others want to join you instead. The doors that had been closed to her in Dubai had led to the opening of doors around the world, and she knew that this was only the beginning of what was possible. When rejection becomes the catalyst for innovation rather than the cause of resentment. The lights of Montecito twinkled below as Isabella pulled into her driveway, already planning the next phase of a journey that had transformed her from someone seeking a seat at existing tables into someone building new tables where everyone had a place.